Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on citizenship, immigration, art, and the American dream, a virtual town hall produced by Roundhouse Theater in Bethesda, Maryland. My name is Kathleen Matthews, and I am a board member of Roundhouse Theater, and really excited to be the MC of your town hall tonight, live streaming on Facebook, where you're going to hear from artists, you're going to hear from people who are experts and advocates for immigration reform, and you're going to hear from first and second generation immigrants to the United States. It's going to be a great conversation. We're going to allow lots of time for questions from all of you, which you are able to send to us through the live chat. And so as the questions come to mind, please type those in, and we'll try to leave enough time to get everybody's questions in. So American Dreams, what an amazing pioneering production. It is a satire on America's immigration process, and it actually uses the cruelty, I think, of a television game show to pick winners and losers of who can become a citizen in the United States. But even more importantly, it implicates the audience, all of the people watching in that process, so that you become party to deciding who wins the game show. Our panelists tonight come from a variety of point of views. We're really lucky to have the writer, co-creator, and one of the stars of American Dreams with us, a second artist who will talk about sort of the intersection of the arts and some of the tough issues that we as Americans, as theater goers, are navigating in our democracy. And then we have people who spend every day on the front lines being advocates for new immigrants, for refugees. And we also have with us tonight a recent refugee who is now a Virginian, who is in the midst of this process, who's going to talk about his perspective. I'm very lucky to have two of our Roundhouse leaders with us, and they're going to help me navigate through all of this. First of all, Roundhouse Theater's managing director, Ed Zakreski, is with us, and we'll bring him up on the screen so you can all see Ed. Thanks for joining us, Ed. And
Thank you,
also Jasmine Jang, who is the PR and partnerships director of Roundhouse Theater. And she's actually the person behind the scenes on the controls to make sure the right people pop up at the right times. First of all, Ed, let me just ask you, what was the reaction this past week to American Dreams? How do you feel about this first major virtual production of our theater company?
I think it was a huge success to bring together working theater out of New York and a number of partners across the country to truly be creating art when everybody is at home because of this pandemic is a rarity in our business right now, and it feels so good to be doing this. And our artistic director, Ryan Roulette, and associate artistic director, Nicole Watson, are the ones who brought this project forward. And we've had very positive feedback from all of our patrons.
Terrific. Great. Well, let's bring up the writer and co-creator of American Dreams, Laila Buck. Laila, you were wonderful in the production. It was wonderful to see you, and even more meaningful knowing that you were the person who created this. Tell us a little bit what brought you as an actor, as a playwright, to tackling this topic in this way.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you to Roundhouse for hosting us, presenting us, and hosting this event. I first have to say that it certainly was not just me that created this play. Tamala Woodard, my wonderful director, and I began talking about more than 4 years ago, summer of 2016, about how we could create something theatrical that would be interactive and participatory and create a space for people to engage with and reflect on questions around immigration and what it means to be a citizen in a personal way that went beyond the sort of sound bites and simplifications that we often get in the media and in sort of national forums. And we wanted to make that fun and playful. And so Tamala came up with the idea of a game show. and as something that could be interactive and something where the audience would actually impact the outcome and the journey of the piece. And so that's where that idea started. And then we had an incredible team of actors who worked with us to develop the play. Jens Rasmussen, who plays my co-host Chris, has been with us since the beginning and helped shape it in so many ways. Imran Sheikh, who plays Usman, really helped generate that character through his work and improvisations with us. Another actor, Osh Ghanima, who's no longer with us, helped create the character of Adil that Ali now plays. Andrew Aaron Valdez, who plays Alejandro, helped create that character in collaboration with a wonderful member of the Cleveland Public Theater community who wanted to remain anonymous, but wanted to share with us the story of his family, his brother who had been deported after serving. So we worked with multiple people who have helped us develop these characters based in large part on their own experience, their families' experiences as immigrants and children of immigrants. And that was really important to all of us, and to me as a child of an immigrant as well.
I know that this play originally was not intended to be presented virtually, but it certainly lent itself to that, probably more than anything I could imagine. When you put the play on this past week, where were you and where were the other actors? How did you virtually come together?
Yeah, we are each in our homes in various parts of the country. I normally am in Brooklyn on Lenape-Hoking land, but I'm currently in Delaware on Montego people's lands. And that is, in part just because we were trying to be closer to family in this time, and also because the set did not fit in our Brooklyn apartment. So, and then we have folks in Cleveland on Erie land. We have folks in Brooklyn on Lenape land. We have Jens is in Chicago. And we have, that's where our primary actors are sort of based right now.
Yeah.
And the team is kind of also between those places as well. All of our amazing
and we had audience members that were not only in a theater in Bethesda, Maryland, but able to enjoy it from all over the country as well.
Yeah. And I have to say that is all of this is only possible because of our amazing design team, Kate Freer and Vidco and the Watsons, Stacy DeRosier on lights and Ryan Patterson on scenic design, Carrie McCarthy on costumes. They really created everything that makes the piece feel like a television show. And that idea to do that was really born of Tamala saying, we could do this. It's a TV show. It exists on a screen. And bringing that amazing, absolutely unique team together. Sam Kuzness on our sound, who's been with us since the beginning, really, of the piece as well. And so we're just really lucky to have a really incredible team of people making it happen.
Thank you. Great. I'm going to jump to Kish Vignaraja, who watched the play on opening night with me. Kish is the CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and a second generation immigrant. Kish, as you know, given your background, which you can tell us a bit about, and the work that you do every day, how did you feel about those topics being tackled by the arts, more specifically in a game show presentation where there really were winners and losers? Turn on your mic.
Sorry about that. I feel like that is
going
to be
the
phrase of 2020.
That's all right.
As the head of a faith-based national immigration nonprofit, I am deeply appreciative. We're at a time right now because the news cycle is so competitive that frankly, immigration has fallen by the wayside in some ways, but I don't want that to obviate the reality, which is that there are people literally dying outside of our borders, and our borders here have essentially been shut in a way that it does feel like a lottery or a fluke and happenstance, who comes in and who doesn't. The fact that we have something called a diversity lottery in reality, I think that of course the game show dynamic is a caricature of it, but I actually think that by doing that, it makes us face a real reality, which is this is the kind of shenanigans that we put immigrants through. And I appreciated sitting in the audience with the ability to weigh in knowing that our actions were determinative, right, of who reaches the promised land and who doesn't, because that's how I want all voters to feel going into the election, to realize that, you know, whether we have 4 more years or a new administration will have a significant impact on immigration. And so it is in our hands right now to decide the fates of immigrants who are seeking refuge here in the US.
And your own background, your parents immigrated to Maryland from India, correct?
From Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, that's right.
And yep. So actually, I myself am a first-generation immigrant. I came, you know, I know some people don't think it counts, but I came when I was 9 months old, and the different candidates that were presented in the play resonated in different ways to me, because my parents were part of the ethnic and religious minority in Sri Lanka. They fled Sri Lanka at the time when the country was truly on the brink of civil war. They were seeking refuge in any country that would take us. At the time, it turned out that Nigeria was the only country, because my uncle had submitted an application for all of his family members, but we hadn't heard anything for years and assumed that our application was dormant. So we had plane tickets in hand, bags packed to move to Nigeria, specifically northern Nigeria, where, you know, many of us know that 276 girls got kidnapped by Boko Haram simply for going to school. And it did feel like we hit the jackpot when we learned just in the nick of time that actually our applications had been approved and we were coming to the US. And we settled very close to the theater in Baltimore, Maryland.
Right. Well, thank you, Krish. We actually have someone on the town hall tonight, Kevin, who is a recent asylum seeker from Honduras, who is joined by a translator, Lisa, to talk a little bit about his very recent experience. So my question to Kevin is, what was it that compelled him to want to seek asylum in the United States, and what was that process like for him?
Hola, Kevin, nos toca. ¿Estás listo? Hola, ¿listo?
Hola.
Kevin, ¿puedes escucharme? Kathleen, I don't think we can hear.
If his feed has frozen there.
Yeah.
Let's give it a second. But I'm
Hola, Kevin, ¿puedes escucharme?
Sí, hola.
Hola, ok. La pregunta es, ¿por qué decidiste de pedir asilo en los Estados Unidos? Y un poquito del proceso. Y tú tienes más o menos 30 segundos, entonces solo un poquito de tu cuento.
Sí, yo solicité a mi...
Disculpe, Kevin, no puedes escucharte.
Ahí de origen lastimosamente.
Kathleen?
Yeah, why don't we...
Can I suggest we come back?
Why don't we come back to Kevin?
Okay.
Because we have Elizabeth Smeisel, who is the attorney at Coalition, or the CARE Coalition. And Elizabeth can talk a little bit about, because they were the facilitators for Kevin's refugee status. In your experience, whether you're speaking about Kevin, who you were advocates for, or other immigrants, what is the compelling sort of driving force usually on their desire, first for asylum, but also secondly for citizenship here in the United States?
Yeah, so I think no one leaves their country and everything behind and makes that decision lightly. So people like Kevin are fleeing things like political violence, sometimes sexual violence, persecution because of their religion, their sexual orientation, persecution because of their race or their beliefs in some other way. Asylum law is pretty limited, so there's only certain bases on which you can win asylum in the United States. There's 5 of them. Kevin's case happened to be one of them, but putting on a case is really complicated. It's resource intensive. All of the clients we represent are doing that work from inside a detention center. 100% of our clients are detained in the Washington, D.C. area. So Kevin's working with me, an attorney during COVID. We're prepping his trial 100% by phone. We're recruiting experts 100% by phone. We're going to court 100% through video and audio. And so COVID-19 has made our jobs more difficult, but the law itself makes our job very difficult. And I think the sense that it is sometimes a game and a lottery and feels unfair, as the play sort of presented, is absolutely the truth as an attorney. In Kevin's case, he was an incredible advocate for himself. He was so brave in his testimony. He was completely forthcoming with the court, incredibly compelling. And like playwrights, he is a storyteller.
Yes.
And his own story was so powerful that now he has won asylum.
Wow, it's an amazing story. Let's see if we can go back to Kevin and see if his service is better, and see if we can re-engage with him to tell us a little bit about that. We have Lisa back. Let's see if we can get Kevin back. Do you want to, looks like his signal's not working there. Maybe there he is. Lisa, why don't you try to ask him what were the motivating factors for him? What was his story that he wanted to share so much, and a case he made for having asylum in this country?
Hola, Kevin, ¿puedes escucharme ahorita?
Sí, le escucho.
Ok, perfecto. Ok, rápido. ¿Puedes explicarme un poquito por qué decidiste de venir a los Estados Unidos y pedir asilo?
Porque por la razón de que mi vida corre peligro en Honduras. Mi país, lastimosamente, mi vida corre peligro en Honduras, y en este país me siento seguro.
¿Y qué pasó en particular en Honduras?
¿Cómo?
¿Qué pasó en Honduras?
En Honduras pasaron muchas cosas, y mediante a eso de que yo me involucré con los derechos humanos de Honduras, que se llama COFADE, que significa Comité de Familiares Desaparecidos en Honduras.
Ajá, ¿y de esto qué pasó?
De eso pasó muchas cosas, porque yo me involucré con eso mediante de que en el año 2009 hubo un golpe de estado en Honduras, y mi hermana fue víctima de ese golpe de estado. Pero igual mi hermana, no solamente ella, sino que muchas familias allá en Honduras fueron víctimas de eso. Maestros, doctores, de todo había en el partido libre y la resistencia de allá, y mi hermana era activista de la resistencia.
Ajá. Okay. Espérame para que yo pueda explicar un poquito, ¿ok?
Estoy haciendo así como un resumen rápido, porque...
Ajá, lo sé, es difícil decir todo en un minutito.
Es mucho más largo todo.
Claro que sí. Ok, espérame un momentito, ¿ok? So, there's a lot of political violence in Honduras, and Kevin and his family got involved with the resistance, trying to prevent people from disappearing, trying to find people who disappeared. And very quickly, they were being persecuted for these activities, including his sister was a victim of the persecution, doctors, teachers, until he felt he was no longer could be safe in Honduras, and decided, a bit out of desperation, to come to the United States.
Wow, amazing story. Well, tell him to hold on, and we'll get back to him in a bit. I want to bring in Sarah Wallach, who is second generation immigrant family, married to first generation immigrant. She teaches at the University of Maryland and is a former Obama administration official. Sarah, as you hear Kevin's story, as you hear Krish's family story, and thinking about your own, which I hope you'll share with us, how do you feel about the depiction of this immigration process as a kind of a lottery, a game show, something where arbitrarily winners and losers in many ways are picked.
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of watching this show this past Sunday night, and I can really relate to the luck of the draw. You know, my parents say that the fact that I was born here, you know, we're very lucky that that happened for me and now for my children. And so I've also heard Warren Buffett actually mention this, which, you know, he grew up here, but he sort of describes the fact that being born here is one of the luckiest things anybody can get sort of across the globe, right? And so from my personal experience has been that my family has unfortunately has had to move several times. My grandmother left India first in 1947 at the time of the partition. And she told me that story, which, you know, is heart-wrenching. They had to leave everything behind. She got on a train. She was in the middle of med school and she left everything to be safe and join her family members in what became Pakistan. And then my parents left Pakistan for similar reasons, and also because my father wanted to pursue a future for himself, which he didn't see in Pakistan. And so then I was born here. But then I actually ended up marrying somebody who is an immigrant as well, but from Poland. And so I've seen the immigration process firsthand from the journey that my husband has taken. And very recently, you know, he became a US citizen as well. And so our children who are, you know, South Asian, Polish Americans are probably a handful of children of that combination, but this country also allows for those beautiful things to happen, even though you know, the immigration system is what it is and needs to be reformed.
So Laila, hearing these immigration stories, what's happening in your heart right now? How do you feel about this and the depiction you've brought us artistically about this process?
I mean, for me, it's just humbling to be part of this panel. I think, you know, it's the whole, for me, all of my work is created in the hope of engaging reflections and conversations around issues like this and connecting people to stories they might not otherwise be able to access emotionally. You know, we may see them on the news or hear them in a soundbite, but we may not be able to access them in a deeper way for some people. And so that's always the goal of my work. So it's very, it's moving to hear Kevin's story, or just the tiniest sliver of his story, you know, in that moment, and to hear the work that everyone is doing. So for me, that's, you know, to me, that's why I make art, and particularly interactive storytelling in these times is just as a form, as a tool for connecting people to issues that we need to engage with. You know, as Kish said, you know, how do we remind people of the impact that our choices and decisions have on people's lives all over the world? And that's something I grew up feeling, living in multiple Arab countries, and as part of an immigrant family, also reckoning with, including now.
Yeah. Mary Catherine Nagel is our second artist on the panel. And Mary Catherine is a Roundhouse Commission playwright, but also an attorney that specializes in cases involving Native nations and tribal sovereignty. Mary Catherine, tell us your view about sort of the role of the arts in tackling issues like this. I know many people go to the theater or to movies because they're looking for escape. They're looking for pure entertainment. But I think artists increasingly feel this responsibility to tackle the tough issues that are immediately in the world around them. What do you see as the role of the arts?
I think the arts are absolutely critical. I think we've always had a narrative problem in the United States. I mean, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, so I see this as a Cherokee woman. And I know what the United States has done, both in its history textbooks and in every kind of platform. There's no coincidence that today Americans are more likely to see Red Face produced by a professional American theater than a play by a native playwright. We've been erased in our own homelands. And when you look at the immigration story, and I think what Laila and everyone have done with this play is so brilliant and so amazing, because there are so many false narratives, right? And by engaging the audience and forcing them to be a part of the conversation and make choices, they realize the false construct. It is a false construct. But we have so many false constructs in the United States, and a lot of them have been erasure of Native people, and that's something that I've used theater to address. And I think that what happens in theater is a human connection that's not possible in the courts or in other political mechanisms, right? You can open hearts and minds to see people for the first time that were otherwise invisible. And that is the true power of theater.
Mary Catherine, do you see the COVID crisis creating some unique opportunities? Because theater is also a place where people come together. You share, the space, you share the noises of the audience reaction. You have the conversation that happens during the intermission and at the end, and you have that community that's created in theater. What are the interesting and challenging, but also potentially positive constructs that something like our quarantine gives an artist, a playwright like yourself?
It's a great question, because what Laila said, she's like, we didn't write this play initially necessarily to be a Zoom, what people are calling a Zoom play or an online virtual play. And so a lot of us artists are sort of grappling with that and how we take the work that we currently have or new work and fashion it in that way. And I think the opportunity here is a deeper connection. Now, nothing replaces live theater, because there's something that happens, especially when we're talking about removing prejudice or changing false narratives, when you're confronted with a real human on stage that otherwise was erased from an American history textbook or Fox News or whatever it could be that erases folks today, right? Theater opens up that door and presents that person. And there's a human connection that happens when you're in that same space. And there's a shared energy and a shared experience. Online, however, what we are finding is that people are able to connect across different barriers. There's an economic barrier to a lot of folks coming to see shows, and they can tune in to a lot of these things online. Of course, Wi-Fi can be a huge economic barrier in and of itself. But apart from that, we're seeing folks across the country. And I think for Indian country, for Native folks in this country, we've been so incredibly invisible. I think what I've seen for a lot of the issues that I work on, like murdered, missing Indigenous women, we've been able to put our stories and survivors and victims' families onto these virtual platforms. And folks are very interested in tuning in. Folks are interested in these connections because they're not getting the live connection. They're not going to work. They're not going to school. And I think it's given us as theater artists an opportunity to dive into that medium and to find ways to explore. And I think what's happening with this play is so exciting. And it just shows what I think personally, and I'm biased, but I think theater artists are the best artists. No, all artists are great artists, but I just think seeing this come alive in this format, and it speaks to the now, it speaks to the political, it speaks to the human, but it just shows how innovative theater artists are.
Great. I'm going to ask the audience to start typing in your questions, and I'm going to have Jasmine start feeding me some questions. But before I do, I'd like to pop back to Kish Vignaraja. And Kish, you suggested that we're at a really important inflection point on this issue of immigration reform. And I want you to tell us, from the work you're doing, what you see as sort of the fork in the road that we maybe are approaching right now as a country, where we need to be going from your vantage point, and how we get there.
Yeah, I think that what we have seen over the last few years is a progressive closing of the golden doors. And by that, I mean, you look at the southern border and you see, what had been families fleeing the worst conditions, children trying to exercise a legal right, fleeing human trafficking. But the pandemic has been used as a public health excuse to close the southern border. If you look at refugee resettlement, which has been historically a bipartisan issue, we've resettled more refugees under Republican administrations than Democratic administrations. President Reagan actually resettled the highest number of refugees, about over 200,000. We went from, at the start of this administration, 110,000 refugees as the ceiling, to 2 weeks ago, President Trump sent a draft of what the number should be, and that is a historic low of 15,000. Argument after argument has been used to close down, H-1B visas, a number of different visa programs. This is why business leaders have spoken out against this. National security officials have explained that in order for us to protect our national security, we need to allow for different pieces of our immigration, and this is where it's really important that I lead a faith-based organization, because so many faith communities believe that a core part of their faith is welcoming the stranger, and that is why I think you turn on the news and you hear a lot of fear-mongering and xenophobia, but when you actually think about America as a nation, if you're not Native American, or if you weren't forced to travel to the U.S. because of slavery, your parents or some generation came over as immigrants, right? 99% of us. And that's why I think it's very important for Americans to realize that accepting immigrants is not just the right thing to do, but it is the smart thing to do, because it makes our economy stronger, our community safer. And that's why these plays are so important, because they give not just a personal face to this issue, but I think they allow for a conversation so that we can fight fiction with fact. And so this is where I really appreciate these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. So Jasmine, why don't you come up and join me and tell me a couple of the questions that we've heard so far, and we'll try to get our panelists to answer them.
Sure. Hi, Kathleen. And again, a reminder to everyone watching, if you'd like to leave a question, you can do so in the chat box next to or underneath the video right now. We've had a couple questions so far about the play, so I think this would be a good chance to bring back our artists. But I'll put them on the screen.
Right. So David Henning wants to know, what has the production crew learned from the different audience responses to this show? I have to say myself, being part of the audience, I didn't want to vote. I didn't want to answer a lot of these questions. I found the temperature checks and everything just so painful to be involved, and I'd love to hear what you think, Laila, about the audience reactions and what you see maybe from night to night in the show.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the reasons it's important to us to do it live and interactive is because those responses impact what happens so much, and it's been what's been powerful, Mary Catherine was talking about this, and I just want to sort of lift that up as well, that there are things that can't happen, of course, in the online theater that can happen only in a room when you can physically breathe together. And there are things that have been happening in this interactive version that intellectually I might have thought about, but experiencing them has been powerful. Like recognizing that there are people in this space together who would never be in physical space together, who would not be at the same theater just because of the realities of where they live and all of that. And so to actually feel like there is a sliver of a national conversation happening when you see people from different areas responding in real time with each other. And so, yes, that aspect of the temperature checks, that is the intention of that section, is really to give the audience both a chance to actually ask whatever question they want, so that there really is an open-ended structure to that for audience engagement, and also to start reflecting on how does it feel to be in the position of jury, in the position of judge, and on stage live show and in this version, it has been powerful to see people progressively less comfortable making a call or sharing what they think. Usually people will start out sort of doing something, and then as things get more intense and the questions more invasive, a lot of people just stop showing their response. And I think that speaks to a lot of what's been said, that, there are things that we, those questions are in large part based on, people that we know who've been through the citizenship process and knowing how invasive that process can be. And also, I should say, my father worked for the State Department, the Foreign Service, and while it wasn't his job to screen people, there are people whose job it is to spend 3 to 5 minutes usually with another human and decide, is this person a threat or can I let them in? And so what I wanted was to put the audience in that position to say, well, okay, say what you like. If it were up to you, what would influence your visceral response? So that is the idea, and it has been moving to hear people's questions, to see their temperature check responses, to hear their audible responses. And my hope is that, as Tamala always says so powerfully, the journey of the play really lives in the audience. So the journey is really about that experience you have in reflecting on what is impacting that decision and how you feel about making it, and how that connects with our beliefs and the systems that impact who gets to be our neighbor, who gets to be a citizen.
Yeah, that's great. If I can bring back Ed Zakreski and maybe Jasmine, you can even jump in here, because you're there, you're watching this play night after night, you're watching the reactions and everything. You also got to see the reviews, which were terrific, the write-ups about it, and you had critics that were actually participating as part of the live audience to all of this. What's been your feeling about the audience reaction to it? Why don't we start with you, Ed?
Oh, Ed, you
turn on your mic.
You'd think I'd know that by now. Having watched this a number of times, one thing that's maybe you don't know, people who produce theater, we love to watch the audience. So when we're sitting in a real theater, we're generally looking out of the side of our eyes to see, like, oh, what are they doing? What are they doing? Well, in Zoom, it's really easy. So it was fascinating to watch the reactions of people. There was one performance that had a number of students, and at the very end of the play, where Usman is taken away, I mean, there were just looks of absolute shock and horror on people's faces. But contrasting, the way people got into answering the questions early on about America's favorites, the favorite comfort food, favorite book, those sorts of things. I think the pandemic has given us the chance to really see a new way of creating interactivity in the theater. Whereas in the traditional setting, as soon as that light comes up and the actor starts to look for somebody, everybody hides. But in Zoom, it's more of an equalizing factor.
Yeah. How about you, Jasmine? What's been your reaction to the audience reaction?
I have also been spying on audiences during the performances, like Ed said. And I think the thing that really struck me, and I say this as an immigrant myself, actually, I was born in Shanghai, China, and moved to the States when I was 3, is it's so interesting seeing how different people bring their own life experiences to the show and leave learning a little bit, more about the immigration process, and or seeing their story reflected more for the first time. So hearing all of these stories has been fascinating. I remember helping my mother study for her citizenship test and learn some of the questions that they actually asked in that first quiz portion. So I think it was a very different experience for me to see that than for someone who maybe didn't know how grueling and how intensive the immigration process really is. So again, just the variety of response has been really, really heartening to me.
I actually felt, Jasmine, that in that first part, there were probably a lot of native-born Americans that were listening to those questions thinking, I don't remember that, or I never learned that. I mean, and how impressive it was as you watched all 3 actors, knowing the answers pretty much to all those questions. Very humbling, I think, for many people.
Absolutely.
I'm going to bring Sarah Wallach, whose husband just went through this process recently as well back. And Sarah, what was your reaction when you were listening to the first part of the show and some of those tough American history questions and civics questions came up? You have kids that are probably learning those things now, but your husband had to learn those things to pass his citizenship test, right?
That's right. And, his journey was very interesting because he and I met when he was studying abroad. And then he had to leave because of his visa. So it was a visa that didn't allow him to stay in the US, which meant that we had to figure out a way to be together. And he had to go home to Europe. And there was no other visa that really would allow him to come back. And I learned actually so much about the visa process and immigration because of our relationship and the fact that we wanted to be together and we couldn't be together because of the hurdles that were put up. And then finally, when we came together through many years of navigating the system, I remember it was in New York that he went to take his oath. And he did study, though I think he somehow knew, again, I think new immigrants know and study these answers a lot more than those of us who grew up here. And so we have to always sort of keep in mind the amount of work and dedication and really desire that people have to be US citizens and how much that, they bring to their hopes and dreams to that oath taking when they do come.
I'm going to jump to Elizabeth Smeisel at Care Coalition. And Elizabeth, I mean, you're prepping people like Kevin like this all the time. As you hear people describe the audience reaction to this in the play, for many people not having firsthand experience with what immigrants have to go through, what's your feeling? What do you think we need to learn from all of this and know about the process? What is it our duty to be better informed about?
Many things. So I think one fact that I hope everyone can take with them from tonight or from the play is a complicated system, right? We've just heard I couldn't be with my partner for years because of a visa. I had to help my mom study for months to pass a test. So people in Kevin's position who are navigating complicated things like that, they have no right to an attorney. So this is not like criminal law, where if you're accused of something, you're given a public defender, regardless of your income. People caught up in the immigration system, whether it's for a visa, seeking asylum, being a child refugee, they have no access to counsel that is paid for by the state. So on top of the racial injustice baked into this immigration system, on top of the immigration injustice baked into our immigration system, there is huge economic injustice baked into this immigration system. Because generally, lawyers are very expensive. So organizations like mine, we do provide free representation. But in a detained context, something like 90% of people in immigration detention in the United States don't have an attorney. And guess what? They're not very wealthy. The single most definitive factor in whether you are going to win an asylum case, particularly if you are detained, is if you have a lawyer. It's not the facts of your case. It's not what happened to you in your country. It's not how well you talk about your claim. It's, is there someone next to you who can help you, empower you, tell that story that so desperately needs to be heard in court? The vast majority of people, like Kevin, have nobody with them. This is not criminal law. There are no Miranda rights. There's no right to call an attorney when you get thrown into detention. You are alone. And so I think what I want people to remember is, as we're hearing these stories, we're remembering what you saw in the play. So many people, most of them who aren't particularly wealthy, are doing that by themselves, often in a foreign language, often having just fled unbelievable, almost indescribable trauma. And none of that is inevitable. None of that has to be that way. In the 1960s, before the 1960s, people accused of crimes also did not have an attorney appointed to them, right? But then a landmark Supreme Court case changed that for the criminal context. We could do the same thing. We could create that political mobilization and that political will so that folks like Kevin are never, ever alone in these unbelievably complicated procedures. And that is why voting matters. That is why engagement matters. That is why the stories that artists are telling about the Kafkaesque system that we have created matters. So there are many facts like that. Children represent themselves by alone. 5-year-olds go to immigration court and have to explain why it is they are eligible for asylum alone. We don't even give kids legal counsel in this country. There are multiple sort of shocking facts like that in every step of the immigration system. And it will only get better if we continue to stay engaged, both artistically and politically.
Thank you. Is there, Elizabeth, I'm going to try to bring Kevin back in. I know he's kind of moving around with his job and everything, but is there something you'd like to ask Kevin, and maybe you can address that to Lisa? Something in particular, because you know his case, that you would like to bring out about his story?
I mean, I want Kevin to be in charge of his story because he was so brilliant in doing that in court. But I think it would be powerful if he could share a few words in particular about being in detention. Kevin was detained over 8 months. After having been persecuted by his government, he was then mistreated by ours. And so Lisa, perhaps you could ask Kevin to speak just briefly about what detention was like for him.
Hola, Kevin. Hola, ok, bueno, ok.
Hola, hola.
La pregunta es que puedes describir un poquito tu experiencia cuando estabas detenido en el centro de detención. ¿Cómo te fue? ¿Cómo fue las condiciones? Así.
Creo que fue un golpe bastante duro a mi vida, ya que yo nunca había estado pues tanto tiempo privado de mi libertad por casi 10 meses, y lo que más extrañé durante todo ese tiempo era el contacto con mi familia, que era muy difícil hablar con mi madre y todo, y las condiciones que se viven ahí en detención es como bien radical todo, porque cuando uno tiene que obedecer todo lo que ellos están diciendo, las órdenes, y a veces no tratan bien a las personas, tampoco como racistas. Son como racistas y pues gracias a Dios yo tuve la oportunidad de salir, de quedarme en Estados Unidos, de poder hacer una vida aquí en Estados Unidos, y creo que el día más que yo me sentí más emocionado, el día que yo tuve una nueva esperanza que llegó a mi vida para poder cumplir el propósito que yo tenía, fue el día que llegó mi abogada Elizabeth a la detención a verme.
Okay, gracias. Espera un momentito. Okay, so Kevin says that, you know, after a terrible journey to the U.S., the conditions that he spent almost 10 months in a detention center. And he said the conditions were terrible. He could never imagine that he's going to be deprived of his liberty like that here in the United States. And he also says it's a very racist system, that, you know, the guards treat the people very poorly, and he suffered a lot of racism. But he did say the best day and the day he felt like he had some hope that things were going to change was the day he met Elizabeth.
Wow. Good on you, Elizabeth, there. Thank you.
I mean, Kevin gives me hope too. That they're extraordinary people, so it's the greatest privilege of my life to work with folks like him.
That's great. I'm going to bring Jasmine back with a couple more questions. I see they're stacking up, and maybe we could put a couple more questions up here. Jasmine, thanks. We have from Ryan, the play is called American Dreams. Do you think the American dream as we know it has been tarnished by the current administration's harsh stance on immigration? Ryan, why don't we get Kish to answer that question?
Sure. The simple answer is yes, absolutely. What we see is immigration avenues, whether it's, you know, what some conservatives would say the legal paths to migration have all been slowed down. Even examples things like special immigrant visas. These are interpreters, translators, drivers who work to protect American soldiers abroad in Afghanistan, Iraq, for example. We had 4,000 visas set aside for them this past year. We only accepted 123. But it's not just that, right? It's the idea that we have ostracized, marginalized even new Americans here. When threats of deportation were made several months ago, we found that in terms of our clients, pews were empty, schools, children didn't attend, playgrounds were empty, because part of the intention is to ensure that people not just don't have a voice, but they even go uncounted. Obviously, a lot of us have been watching closely the debate about the census. There is an intention across the board, whether it's closing the borders, whether it's targeting immigrants who are here, that we have chosen to deny the American dream. And I appreciate the question, because I think that is very much what's at stake in this election.
Thank you. Jasmine, let's pull up another question from our audience. From Susan, we have, I was interested that all three contestants were male. Is this a function of actor availability? I'm going to have Laila answer this. And I think there's a really interesting answer here that I heard, Laila.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It gets asked a lot. I wish I could have a little PSA at the show about it, but yeah, we started with one of our first actors. Our first workshop was a wonderful actor and friend, Rasha Zamamiri, who was playing a Syrian woman in that first round. And we realized quickly that everyone would always vote for the woman when there was one woman or two women and one man. It became, there was people who identified or who others identified as women. I think by and large are still seen as less threatening, and then people who are identified as male, whether that's how they identify or not. And that is because we wanted very much to be exploring and exposing a visceral response that is in many ways connected to fear and to our perception of who might be a threat in some way. It quickly became clear that we needed all of the contestants to be men in order to explore that in this version. I still look forward to writing the all-female version because there are certainly many things to explore there. And obviously both Tamala and I are women, and there are some phenomenal actors I would love to collaborate with in that version. But for this one, it felt important to explore our responses to men, in particular men from places like Mexico, Pakistan, Palestine, places that are often maligned as places where dangerous people come from.
Great. Let's pull up another question, Jasmine. From Hala, we have, in the forms one fills out, the applicant is referred to as the alien, like someone from outer space. What does that tell us? Do you want to tackle that one, Elizabeth?
Sure. So again, this is part of what is baked into our law. And in the immigration statute, it's one giant, very complicated federal statute. People who are seeking immigration relief are, as a matter of law, called aliens. And when people come to the United States in the way that Kevin did, so fleeing persecution, for example, and crossing a border, Kevin had a threshold interview with an immigration official. The moment you are in contact with immigration officials, you are given an alien number. That number replaces your name, it replaces your identity, it replaces your nationality. You are reduced to 9 digits. And judges do not call you by name when it is your time to present your case. They call you by your A number. This is one way that making horrific decisions that might be sending someone back to danger, destruction, or death is made easier for the people who have that task. It is a dehumanization, and we know, prisoners are given numbers. Horrific things have happened when we start to pull away someone's identity. And I think storytelling and art, the painters, the playwrights, the songwriters, the filmmakers out there insist on humanity, and the intersection of law and art is, I think, something that we need more of as attorneys. I think we need to be paying more attention to the way that our artist brothers and sisters are talking about the stuff that we work in, because humanity doesn't mean anything if it's not shared. And I think that's what artists do. They remind us that humanity has to be shared, even in the midst of a system that every step of the way tries to strip people of it.
Yeah. We now have about 15 minutes left in our stream. And so we're just going to try to pack in the questions and also give everybody a chance to summarize and say goodbye. So Jasmine, why don't you give me another question here? This is Roundhouse Theater from a message. Kish, Elizabeth, Mary Catherine, I would love to hear legislation initiatives or candidates you recommend, you know, that you're watching in this election cycle or on a local or national level. So you know, who were the big advocates on Capitol Hill, maybe in state legislatures, candidates that have really put this issue front and center that you think audience members, people who are watching tonight, should know about and potentially think about supporting? Mary Catherine, are there people that you're working with that you think you want to put on people's radar?
Absolutely. You know, it's not, it was just this last election that we got our first 2 ever Native women elected to Congress. That's not because we aren't still here. It's just because we've been erased in our own homelands. But, you know, I do want to say, and I'm so appreciative of being invited to this conversation tonight. I think it's indicative of some of the larger problems we have in the United States that I was invited to this conversation only to talk about what it means to be an artist in the Zoom context, in the virtual context, and not to discuss what it means to be a Native American and to discuss citizenship and immigration today. I can tell you this, the biggest problems our nation faces today are because of violence and things, systemic things that have been enacted on Native people on these lands. If we're truly going to solve them, we have to talk about them. And we can't put Native people to the side and not recognize that this has all happened to us. And not to me as some specific person, but let's just be real for a second. Part of the problem here, right, is the colonialist history of the entire construct that has colonized our sovereign tribal nations. These borders, the fact that a lot of the people that are trying to come to here, to this part of the United States today, were here way before any of the immigrants, before Columbus got lost in 1492, before 1776. That's a false narrative, right? That they're immigrants. They're descended from people who were here in way before 1492. The fact that families are being separated violently today has happened systemically to Native people for hundreds of years. So, you know, I'm so happy to be here tonight, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. But it has been frustrating to, as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, to be invited only to comment on the fact that we're, as playwrights, trying to deal with this virtual Zoom reality, when really all of the political issues that have been brought up, Native people have very specific, important things to say on that. I know we're not often recognized or included in the dialogue, but it's very important. What's happening at the border is affecting tribal nations, because tribal nations weren't United States, Mexico. We existed long before these new sovereigns came into play. And I think that's an important part of the conversation that shouldn't be overlooked.
Great. Thanks for raising the consciousness on that, Mary Catherine. Kish and Elizabeth, are there candidates or is there legislation that you'd like to kind of highlight, showcase in answer to the question of you know, who's leading these efforts on immigration reform at this point in our country?
Sure. So I can jump in initially, and I'll just quickly say, because I really do appreciate Mary Catherine's comments just now. I do think that there is such an important connection between how we treat, you know, our Native population and what we believe as new Americans, because I do think that there is a close connection. Even earlier today, we were having a conversation about part of our climate initiative, and recognizing that the first American climate refugees are actually the indigenous population that lives off the Ile de Jean Charles, off of the coast of Louisiana. And I also think that, realizing that this discussion, at a time of the racial justice discussion more broadly that's been happening, it was CBP officers and potentially ICE officers that were deployed to Portland, right? But we've seen the militarization of our immigration response at our southern border. It only was a matter of time before we saw that kind of law enforcement response to peaceful protesters, more inland. In terms of politicians being the head of a 501c3, I won't, suggest any endorsements, but I will say that we have had some really great support in Senator Coons, in Lofgren, in Congressman Castro. But in terms of specific legislation that I would flag, things that are an issue really truly today. One is, as I mentioned, the refugee presidential determination number. The president issued it literally just before midnight, before the end of the fiscal year. But that is something that has been being debated right now. As I mentioned, it is the historic lowest number we've ever seen by far of 15,000. So, welcome if you could contact your member of Congress and say, this is atrocious, this is not who we are as a country. That would be helpful. The other issue I think I would flag as live is just related to children. At the southern border, they are continually summarily expelled. There was a federal ruling suggesting that it was inappropriate both to put children into private hotels and have them overseen by private security contractors, but also that they have a legal right to seek asylum. And so, again, raising this issue, recognizing that family separation is still happening. We had a mother who just gave birth to a child and was immediately separated from the child when she was imprisoned. That's why 2 years ago, the IRS was asked by the government to help reunify children. And the sad reality is, though it's not in the news every day today, it is still happening.
Thank you. Elizabeth, anything you want to add to that?
So I think what I will say is I don't think on immigration that, so it's bad right now and it starts from the top. And I do think that needs to be replaced. But sort of what Mary Catherine was saying is, I think there needs to be a reckoning with American history from a very, very long time ago. Now, does politics play a part of that? Sure. Is the Democratic Party going to fix it? No. Barack Obama deported more people than any other president in history, including this one. His Justice Department fiercely, adamantly defended family detention that Chris just described. So I could say some names of people. And I think that one presidential candidate, in my view, is far better. But until each of us in our hearts, with our families, in our communities of faith, do that hard reckoning work that Mary Catherine is talking about, the kind of change that we really need is still a long way off. However, in the meantime, I do think that when it comes to people that I work with personally, and that very small corner of my universe, things like having legal representation afforded, to everyone across the board, regardless of economic background, would be a huge change. I think refugee caps increasing would be a huge and important change. And some of that will flow from politics, but we have a lot of soul searching to do about the past, several hundred years, which I think Mary Catherine stated really well. Great,
thank you. Jasmine, why don't you try to pop up a few more questions for us? From Bonnie Hammerschlag, this place seems like a perfect teaching instrument for young people. Are there plans for more young people, school-age kids, to see this production? Jasmine and Ed, does one of you want to tackle that?
I'll offer a little bit, and then maybe Laila can talk a little more broadly. because I know involving university students was an important part of the development of this production. I can say that Roundhouse, as a part of our free play program, which gives free tickets to students age 13 through college, any play, anytime, we had 187 students who were able to watch American Dreams for free. That was almost 15% of the total audience that participated. And we can only do that because that program is underwritten by our generous donors. So thank you to all of them.
Great. Laila, how about as it moves to other venues, as it moves from Roundhouse to some of the other theaters that are collaborators?
Yeah, certainly. We've had a good amount of university students, as I was mentioning, and we've had some, just family member young people in some of our shows, and certainly that is the intention of putting it out there around the country in various venues to allow for that, and also to have tickets be pay what you can, so that it's accessible to particularly young people who may not have the means, as many of us do not, to pay for theater or many things in these times. And I also just want to lift up what Mary Catherine said, and how important it is that we, and also just to name that as playwright of a play about immigration and citizenship, I really had to come to a reckoning with myself at how, for the fact that, in part because of the system, that the world that the play represents is not a world that would recognize Native or Indigenous peoples, or that colonial settler violence in history, and to the present day. How could we actually also honor and highlight the fact that when you're talking about immigration, when you're talking about citizenship, you have to be talking about Native and Indigenous people and the violence that is in the foundation of this country. And so, we came up with sort of this closing slide language that we have as just one way of trying to acknowledge that as such an important thing for us to reckon with. And the idea of sort of follow-up emails after each presentation is that they provide not only that sort of language, but also resources that have been provided in consultation with Dr. Brian Brayboy at ASU Gamage, and with Delana Studi, wonderful actor and playwright, and Native activist as well, and consultant for organizations people can support. So I encourage you to follow those. Each of our presenters is supposed to be highlighting those as well during the course of their runs, so that we are actually hopefully engaging people to be reflecting more deeply on what are the steps we can actually take to reckon with that history and to change that present, as it still impacts so many around the country.
Great, thank you. Maybe we can get one or two more questions in, Jasmine. Roundhouse Theater, an anonymous question. Mary Catherine is the only panelist who is not an immigrant. What are your recommendations on how allies can help advocate for Native populations? Turn on your mic. Turn on your mic.
I'm sorry. Okay.
There we go.
Wow. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Very much appreciate this question. And, again, going back to this point, right? It's the erasure of Native people is what allows the dysfunctional conversation about immigration to happen here in the United States today. Trump is an immigrant. Okay, let's be clear about that. And the fact that he's an immigrant and we're not talking about that, and we're talking about other immigrants, about whether or not they should be allowed in or not allowed in, while Trump's existence on this land is just accepted and he can determine that as the current president, is because Native people have been erased. So I very much appreciate this question about how to help Native people. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have for Native people is the erasure, right? Is the fact that we're not discussed, we're not invited to the conversation. But also, I do think it harms us too, that it's not understood that everything that's been done to us is repeating itself. It's a giant cycle in the United States. You can look at history and you can say, okay, well, what did we do to Japanese Americans, many of whom were actually citizens, some were immigrants during World War II, when we put them in concentration camps? Guess what? Andrew Jackson did the same thing to us. Okay, removing children from families at the border and imprisoning them. Guess what? The U.S. military did that to tribal nations, and they're still doing it today through state adoption agencies that steal Native children from families. So what can we do? Well, one, we can involve Native people in these conversations because we have something to give, and that's that we've survived it, and we've learned how to survive it, and we can give those tools to other people, but also our solidarity, because we want to stand with other folks, right? We want to stand in community. And I think we have to change the narrative. We're never going to solve this. We should vote. We should all vote, and we need to change law and policy. That's very important. But this is where arts come into play. This erasure is why we have the dysfunction today. If people actually had the stories, the reality, the true history, they wouldn't stomach what was happening today. I really believe that. But history has been taught incorrectly for a reason, not just to keep Native people down, but to keep everyone else down, whether you're a person of color or an immigrant or, not a heterosexual, whatever that is. And so, again, I just think, how can we support Native people? Stop erasing us, right? Include us, allow us to be a part of the conversation, not just for a short little bit, but because we have actually something to contribute that speaks to the substance of the challenge that you face today.
Thank you. I want to thank Mary Catherine for joining us tonight, and our amazing group of panelists, Laila Buck, the writer, co-creator, and star of American Dreams, Kish from the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, Sarah Wallach, sharing her family's immigrant story, Elizabeth Schmeisel from CARE Coalition, and of course, Kevin. It was great that he was able to join us and tell his very powerful story. And thank you to Roundhouse for facilitating this conversation after the play, the conversation that we would be hopefully having in the theater lobby in normal circumstances, but are able to have in this wonderful StreamYard context. It just really is fabulous and is true to Roundhouse's mission, which is facilitating really in-depth exploration of important issues, showcasing people's stories, and giving us tools that can actually help us make good decisions, whether it's at the ballot box on November 3rd or in our day-to-day lives, the kind of organizations we decide to support and how we interact with our fellow human beings. So thank you, everyone. Great to have you all with us. And again, thank you to Roundhouse for doing this.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.